Newcastle and Liverpool might just have delivered the game of the season so far. 6 goals, high energy football and last minute drama led to a thrilling 3-3 draw at St James's Park. But this game wasn't just about the goals. In today's episode, I'll be deep diving into a tactical analysis of how Eddie Howe's Newcastle exposed Liverpool's unbreakable defence, the in-possession tactical tweak that Arne made at half-time that allowed Liverpool to take the lead in the second half, and how Eddie Howe finally unlocked the Bruno Guimarães and Sandro Tonali partnership in midfield. And this match wasn't just about the result. Newcastle have found the blueprint for how they could play for the remainder of the season, and Liverpool showed the type of resilience that could just bring the title to Anfield at the end of the season. Make sure to like the video if you enjoy the content and subscribe to be the first to watch the new releases, and stay tuned for a special bonus segment on Curtis Jones. Now let's jump into the analysis. In terms of the basic setup of Liverpool during this game, especially in the first half, they set up in a 4-2-3-1 with a double pivot of Gravenberch and McAllister, and Jones playing as a high number 10 just behind Darwin Núñez. There were some key personnel changes to Liverpool against Newcastle that Newcastle tried to exploit in build-up and transition. And they were the introduction of Quansah at right back and Gomez replacing Konate at right centre-back. And Newcastle's tactics worked, especially in the first half, but also continued into the second half. And if you look at the expected goals against for Liverpool this season, it's at 0.88 goals per game. But against Newcastle, the expected goals against was 2.09, which was a marked difference in terms of the kind of threat that opposition teams have posed Liverpool this season. And Newcastle had a clear tactic to attack down their left-hand side against Quansah and Gomez, and they attacked down that left-hand side 43% of the time in that game. And if you look at Newcastle's positional setup and the average positions they took up in the game, you can see it's more of a lopsided 4-4-2 than their normal 4-4-3. Gordon stayed high and wide, and Isak also drifted to that left-hand side. And you can see they had that midfield four of Joelinton, number 7, Guimarães and Tonali in the middle, and Jacob Murphy acting as a sort of traditional right midfielder. And Newcastle are great at this because Joelinton in that left central midfield spot has the energy and the stamina to cover space in behind Gordon when he stays high and wide. And if we look at a quick visual from the game, you can see the type of runs that Alexander Isak was trying to make in the game. You know, he's focusing on making it on the blind side of Gomez, but far enough away from Van Dijk where Van Dijk doesn't want to go with the run. And I think one of the other reasons they sort of focused on that left-hand side is we know although Salah's great going forward and he does put in the sort of pressing intensity, you know, towards centre-backs, there is gaps in behind him, which I highlighted in my previous slot analysis, that can be exposed by opposition teams. And Newcastle's plan to attack down that left-hand side and expose that right-hand side partnership of Gomez and Quansah was summed up in their second goal. Liverpool are recovering structurally from a previous set piece, I think it was, but Newcastle are back in shape, and Tonali plays a lovely ball into Guimarães' feet, and we'll come into their partnership later on in the video. But as you can see, Isak is just coming back from offside position, and he doesn't target Van Dijk's side. He goes straight to that left-hand side, you know, building that partnership with Gordon and trying to exploit both Quansah and Gomez. You can see Gomez has sight of Isak coming back on side, but he's unable to sort of place himself in a position that prevents that pass into his feet. Guimarães on the ball with time will find Isak, and he plays a lovely pass just inside of Gomez to Isak, and that's where the problems start because Quansah doesn't know whether to go with Isak or just track the run and let sort of Gomez recover into that position. But he kind of half goes to Isak and just lets a nice little easy ball inside of him, you know, for Gordon's run. And Gordon does lovely here to use Gomez's momentum to chop back inside and put a lovely finish beyond Kelleher. And although Newcastle improved in their build-up in this game, which we'll come on to later on in the video, Liverpool allowed the kind of game that is a trademark of Eddie Howe's Newcastle. The sort of high energy, high press, lots of space to exploit in behind, and the kind of game where they're able to create lots of chances from transitionary moments. And what Newcastle did really well in defence was when they went for a high press, they pushed someone up against Liverpool's number 6, usually Gravenberch, but also McAllister when he dropped in there. And when they dropped in deep, what they had was a flat midfield 5, nice and narrow, trying to prevent spaces in behind their midfield zone in central areas. And this is an example of Newcastle in their high press, where they try and apply pressure to that number 6. And you can see that Joelinton starts to press on Gravenberch, But he doesn't stop there. As Gravenberch passes that ball to the left-hand side, he continues that press, and Newcastle see the trigger to try and lock Liverpool down that left-hand side. And Robertson can play that ball into Van Dijk's feet and they can circulate it back. But he tries to play into Gravenberch, which they're used to doing this season. But Bruno Guimarães is just ready for this and already starts to make that pressing movement to Gravenberch. Gravenberch lacks that awareness, attempts to turn on the ball and doesn't notice that Bruno is already within distance. Bruno's great at this situation. You know, he times the tackle really well. And as they win that ball, you can see the sort of numerical superiority they have in the centre of that pitch if the ball was to be won. And as Bruno wins that ball, it falls to Joelinton, who's able to progress with the ball. And you can see the type of situation that Newcastle are trying to create on the transition, with Isak making that running behind, Gordon making that running behind, and Jacob Murphy making that running behind, with Bruno supporting play. And you can see here, this is the kind of situations that Newcastle were building on numerous occasions against Liverpool's back line. Newcastle were a threat all game, especially from these transition moments. But it's what Arne did at halftime, a tactical tweak in possession that allowed them to assert more control and dominance in the game and prevent these situations from occurring as regularly as they happened in the first half. Not only that, it allowed Liverpool to assert a bit more dominance in the attacking third of the game. And you can see from their XG created the difference between the first half and the second half. And if you look at the XG graphic, you can see they're creating a low amount of chances in that first half, and the quality of those chances is quite low as well. And if you compare that to the second half, you know, numerous high quality chances in the middle of the box and the 6-yard box where a couple of their goals came. And if you look at Liverpool's setup in that first half, you can see they had that 4 at the back with the double pivot of McAllister and Gravenberch, Núñez quite high among the centre-backs, Jones floating from the centre-backs and trying to find pockets of space behind Newcastle's midfield line, and Gakpo out wide, and sadly you can't see him out wide as well. And the problem with this, which Slot probably saw at half-time, was that if they were to pass that into Gravenberch's or McAllister's feet, Newcastle are already in a great position to press them from behind, and the links between that midfield two and the wide players and the strikers is kind of straight lines. It's not really sort of anything that Newcastle would struggle to deal with if McAllister or Gravenberch were to receive the ball. So Slot changed 3 things at half-time to drag Liverpool back into this game. And they moved to a single pivot system, which they did on an odd occasion in that first half, but he made sure they stuck with it a lot more in the second half. The fullbacks pushed up, sometimes beyond the Newcastle midfield, to create extra passing options or distractions for Newcastle's deep or mid block. And they also tried to overload those wide areas, which we saw on transitions, but also in build-up as well. And there's 2 clips that show these 3 changes so well. And if we jump into the first visual, you can see that as Liverpool have the ball at centre-back with Virgil van Dijk, Newcastle set up in that midfield block, you know, that tight central block, you know, that's trying to prevent those passes through the central areas into their number 10s. And you can see from this visual why Slot made this change and the impact it was having on Newcastle. Isak was the only one up top trying to cut off half the pitch, and so they had that space and numerical superiority with Gomez, Gravenberch and Van Dijk. And you can see the type of screening dilemmas that Newcastle have in the midfield line once Van Dijk passes that ball to Gravenberch. Gravenberch is able to either pass that ball into McAllister if Bruno moves out wide and screens Robertson, or he's able to pass it to Robertson, which is what happens because Bruno is trying to sort of make sure the centre of the pitch is secure. And one of Newcastle's other defensive tactics was their high press and making sure someone was pressing Liverpool's number 6. And as was Newcastle's setup in the first half, they had this 4-4-1-1 shape with one of the midfielders pushing up against the deep line playmaker from Liverpool. And in this case, it's Curtis Jones, who has no interest in getting involved in the play. The full-back stretch wide, and that allows sort of the space for the centre-backs to carry the ball up the pitch. And as Quansah carries the ball up the pitch, you can see the dilemmas they were trying to cause Newcastle, especially with the positioning of Darwin Núñez. You know, he wouldn't stay central in between Cher and the other centre-back. He would drift wide to the side that Liverpool were playing down. And what that did was it pinned Newcastle's back line and prevented them from having that spare centre-back that would go and press Liverpool's third midfielder in between their midfield and defensive line. And Liverpool made it hard for Newcastle to screen all the options into that third or that free midfielder. And as you can see, Tonali, who was high with Curtis Jones at the time, tries to drop in back into that number 6 role, but it's too late. And Joelinton can't screen this pass, or there's an easy pass into Darwin Núñez's feet. And these are the kind of dilemmas and different passing options that Slot created in that second half. And we've become accustomed to this now from Slot at Liverpool. His tactical acumen and his ability to see where the problems are and fix them so quickly during the course of a game will stand Liverpool in great stead for the title race ahead. Now onto a special bonus segment on Curtis Jones. And he played so well on Wednesday night against my club, Newcastle, which is hard to say, but he also has played well over the course of this season. And he's had some doubters as to whether he can nail that starting spot for Liverpool, especially under Jurgen Klopp. But under Slot, this system suits him perfectly. If you look at his pass map from the game against Newcastle, he got dropped back into that deep line playmaker role when Szoboszlai came on and Gravenberch came off. But he's all over the pitch and he's able to pick up these lovely positions in between Newcastle's midfield and defensive line, and so many successful passes. I think he only had 2 unsuccessful passes in the game, and that showed the influence he was having for Liverpool as the game progressed. And if you look at Curtis Jones's FB ref radar, based on Opta stats, comparing him against other attacking midfielders this season, you can see the number of passes attempted, the pass completion, both in the 99-98 percentiles. And that's even more impressive when you see that his progressive passes, the number of risks he's probably taken in the game, he's in the 87th percentile. But it's not just on the ball where he's having an influence this season. It's his off-the-ball running and movement in between the lines, which is causing havoc for Premier League teams this season. And you can see the impact of his off-ball movement in that second goal for Liverpool. McAllister plays a lovely ball over the top after Lewis Hall's poor pass, and Salah's through, on the counter-attack. And you can see at this point, Tonali is in line with Curtis Jones, but it's a small lapse in concentration from Tonali. As the play progresses, Curtis Jones recognises that space in between Dan Burn and Lewis Hall, and he knows Joelinton is probably going to go cover in case Salah cuts inside. And Jones makes a great run into the box, expertly found by Mohamed Salah, and a fantastic finish into the top right-hand corner. Now make sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content, and we'll deep dive now into how Eddie Howe unlocked that partnership between Bruno Guimarães and Sandro Tonali. And although they started against Crystal Palace, this was the game where it all came together. And as I said in my previous video, which you can check here, somewhere I'll put it as a card, Tonali has to be trusted in that number 6 role, and Bruno moved higher up the pitch to help with that chance creation and patterns of play in the attacking third. And one of the key things that Eddie Howe did with this partnership is he didn't force Bruno to move higher up the pitch and try and find those gaps in between the opposition midfield and defensive line. He allows Bruno to do what he does best and drop into that double pivot alongside Sandro Tonali. And in this visual, you can see it starts with Tonali, head on the swivel in that number 6 position, aware of what's going on around him, making an option on the ball, Fabian Schär. And as he moves towards the ball, he receives it and plays a nice little pass out to Livramento, but he leaves the gap, for someone to exploit, which is, I think, a tactical design from Eddie Howe. And as Tonali makes that pass to Livramento, he makes a nice little movement in behind Robertson to drag away Curtis Jones and create even more space and a clear passing line into the space he's left behind him. And that's where Bruno is able to have that freedom to drop into that number 6 position and have even more space to work with than he usually would do. And this is what Bruno loves. He loves the player to get up against him, feel him out, and try and maneuver the ball away from him. And that's what he does to McAllister, plays the ball out wide to Lewis Hall. And this is another pattern of play that developed as well throughout the game, with Isak moving away from that defensive line and finding pockets of space either side of Gravenberch and McAllister, which I said in my previous video for Slot, as a way to exploit their team. And although they have slightly similar profiles in terms of their technical ability, they have slightly different risk profiles in that number 6 position. And Tonali loves to keep it a bit more simple, playing on the one touch, sideways passes, keeping the ball moving, and it gives a bit more rhythm to Newcastle. Whereas Bruno likes to take a bit more risk, feel the players and oppositions around him, roll off them, and play those sort of balls through the thirds with a bit more risk. And Newcastle's first goal shows Bruno's risk profile in that number 6 position perfectly. He receives that ball from Fabian Schär in that number 6 position, which he's given the license to do with Tonali sort of pushing higher up. McAllister presses him on the ball, and this is where, some players would just like to keep it safe, try and bounce it back, just protect the ball. But he goes 1v1 versus McAllister, gets beyond him, and that's where he opens up that sort of passing line into the front players. And this is where Bruno's vision and quality on the ball shines through, especially in that number 6 position. And he's able to find Isak's run, into his feet, and Isak does the rest with a beautiful finish from long range as well. And if you look at the FBref radar for Bruno Guimarães, his Opta stats comparing him to the other midfielders in the top 5 big European leagues. Over the last year, he's in the 97th percentile for successful take-ons, and the 92nd percentile for progressive passes. And the balance of this midfield three has worked perfectly. And after a run of games, we're hoping the relationships and patterns of play can build, but it's against the low blocks that Newcastle really need to improve this season. And with the technical ability of Tonali at that number 6 and Bruno in that number 8 position, there should hopefully be more success for Eddie Howe's Newcastle. And I highlighted it in my tweet before the Liverpool game that I was probably more confident in Eddie Howe's Newcastle against title chaser Liverpool at home than away to Crystal Palace in a relegation zone. And that's because Newcastle struggle against these low blocks. And it was Newcastle's attacking intent, the relationship they built between Sandro Tonali and Bruno Guimarães, and Liverpool's resilience and the tactical tweaks they made at half-time that made this such an amazing game. And if you enjoyed this tactical breakdown, make sure to check out my analysis on Arne's Liverpool from earlier on in the season, and also my analysis on Eddie Howe's Newcastle and what's gone wrong from them this season. Leave in the comments, what did you think of the game? Was this the game of the season so far? Who were your standout players or tactical tweaks that you saw in the game? And I'll see you on the next episode of A Game of Two Halves.